The transport plane descended through humid Pacific air toward a runway that shouldn't exist. Carved from volcanic rock and black ash, the airstrip on Iwo Jima materialized below like a scar across an island that seemed to reject human presence. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi felt the aircraft shudder as wheels touched down on June 19, 1944. The door opened, releasing a wave of heat so oppressive it felt solid, wrapping around him like wet cloth. At 52 years old, Kuribayashi had served his emperor for decades, rising through ranks during an era when Japan's military power expanded across Asia. He carried documents bearing the personal seal of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, orders that could be summarized in brutal simplicity. Defend this worthless piece of volcanic rock until every man under his command lay dead. Stepping onto black sand that crunched beneath his boots, Kuribayashi surveyed terrain that mocked conventional military wisdom. 8 square miles of desolation stretched before him, dominated by an extinct volcanic cone called Mount Suribachi, rising from the island's southern tip. Black sand covered everything, volcanic ash so fine it infiltrated clothing, equipment, food, creating a constant gritty presence. The air smelled of sulfur, a reminder that geological forces had created this place from underwater eruptions, thrusting rock and ash above Pacific waters. No trees grew here, no vegetation beyond scraggly brush clinging to rocky ground. Water was scarce, food had to be imported, every supply item required shipping across hundreds of miles of ocean increasingly controlled by American submarines and aircraft. Before departing Tokyo, Kuribayashi had visited his wife Yoshi in their modest home. Their conversation remained private, but Yoshi later recounted her husband's words with devastating clarity. He had told her to prepare for his death, explaining with characteristic directness that orders to command Iwo Jima's defense constituted a death sentence. He would not return, his body would not return, likely even his ashes would remain on that volcanic island 750 miles south of Japan's home islands. Yoshi had accepted this with the stoicism expected of military wives during wartime, though grief surely overwhelmed her private moments. Their children were young, growing up during years when Japan's initial victories gave way to steady defeat as American industrial might slowly crushed the empire's overextended forces. Iwo Jima occupied a position of critical strategic importance, though its value lay entirely in geography rather than any inherent worth. The island sat approximately equidistant between recently captured American bases in the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland. 3 airfields had been constructed, allowing Japanese fighter aircraft to intercept American B-29 Superfortress bombers flying northward to bomb Japanese cities. These massive 4-engine bombers represented technological achievement and industrial capacity that Japan could not match. Each B-29 cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, carried tons of incendiary or high-explosive bombs, and flew at altitudes that placed them beyond reach of most Japanese fighters. But the flight from Mariana's bases to Tokyo stretched bomber range to maximum limits. Fighters escorting these missions couldn't carry enough fuel to reach Japan and return. Damaged bombers had nowhere to land between Saipan and Japan, forcing crews to ditch in the Pacific or attempt perilous flights home with wounded aboard and engines failing. If American forces captured Iwo Jima, strategic calculations shifted dramatically in their favor. Japanese early warning capability would be eliminated. Emergency landing fields would allow damaged bombers to set down, repair, and continue operations. Most significantly, P-51 Mustang fighters based on Iwo Jima could escort bombing missions all the way to Tokyo, providing protection that would reduce bomber losses significantly. American military planners understood these advantages clearly. Iwo Jima had to be taken. The question was never whether American forces would attempt invasion, but when that invasion would occur, and at what cost. Neither Kuribayashi nor the approximately 21,000 soldiers who would eventually garrison Iwo Jima understood the scale of horror awaiting them. They could not know they were about to fight what would become the bloodiest battle in United States Marine Corps history. A 36-day meat grinder demonstrating both the futility of Japan's defensive strategy and the extraordinary courage of men ordered to die for a cause already lost. The Empire's situation had deteriorated catastrophically since the war's opening months. Initial victories across the Pacific, stunning in scope and speed, had created an expanded defense perimeter Japan lacked resources to hold. American industrial production, once fully mobilized for war, dwarfed Japanese capacity. American shipyards produced aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them. American aircraft factories churned out fighters and bombers in quantities that overwhelmed Japanese production. American training programs produced pilots by the thousands, while Japanese training infrastructure collapsed under relentless pressure. Assignment to command Iwo Jima carried complex meanings within Japanese military politics. On June 8th, Kuribayashi received rare honor of a personal audience with Emperor Hirohito on the eve of his departure. Such audiences were granted sparingly, reserved for officers undertaking missions of highest importance. Yet historians examining the selection process have suggested darker motives. Kuribayashi had made powerful enemies within ultranationalist circles dominating Japanese military policy during the war years. His views, shaped by extensive experience in America, clashed fundamentally with ideological orthodoxy, demanding absolute faith in Japan's spiritual superiority over materially wealthy but supposedly decadent Western powers. From 1928 to 1930, Kuribayashi served as deputy military attaché in the United States. Unlike many Japanese officers whose foreign postings consisted primarily of formal diplomatic functions, Kuribayashi traveled extensively across America, observing with professional curiosity rather than ideological prejudice. He studied at Harvard University, examining American educational systems and intellectual culture. He visited factories, witnessing assembly line production methods that Japanese industry had barely begun implementing. He toured steel mills, automobile plants, aircraft manufacturing facilities, observing industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Japan possessed. American energy, American innovation, American vast natural resources, all impressed him deeply while simultaneously filling him with foreboding about his nation's strategic trajectory. In letters to his wife during this American posting, Kuribayashi expressed views that would later mark him as defeatist among hardline military leaders. He wrote that the United States represented the last country in the world Japan should fight. American industrial potential was huge and fabulous, he observed, while the people were energetic and versatile in ways that made them formidable adversaries. Such realism, during an era when Japanese military doctrine emphasized spiritual power over material resources, made Kuribayashi suspect among officers who believed Japanese fighting spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. The cult of the offensive, the glorification of death in combat, the insistence that Japanese soldiers possessed unique warrior virtues that would guarantee victory, these ideas dominated military thinking. Officers who questioned such orthodoxy risked their careers, or worse, assignment to suicide missions disguised as critical defensive operations. Despite personal misgivings about Japan's war against America and its allies, Kuribayashi approached his assignment with characteristic professionalism. He would do his duty, defend the island to the last man as ordered, but he would do so with innovative tactics designed to maximize American casualties rather than simply dying gloriously in futile charges. His first action upon arriving was inspecting existing defensive preparations. What he found appalled him. The garrison had been digging beach trenches according to standard Japanese defensive doctrine that had characterized island defense throughout the Pacific War. Defend at the water's edge, contest every landing, die gloriously on the beaches where enemies could see Japanese courage. Kuribayashi ordered this work stopped immediately. He had studied American amphibious assaults on Tarawa, where Japanese beach defenses had been obliterated by naval gunfire before Marines ever landed. He had analyzed the disaster at Saipan, where futile banzai charges wasted thousands of Japanese lives without significantly delaying American victory. Traditional doctrine was worse than useless. It was suicide without purpose. Iwo Jima would be different. Kuribayashi would implement revolutionary strategy. Defense in depth based on fortified positions deep underground, designed to survive the heaviest bombardment and inflict maximum casualties over an extended period. Rather than contesting the beaches where naval gunfire would annihilate defenders, Kuribayashi would allow Americans to land unopposed, draw them inland away from naval gun support, then destroy them from prepared positions that bombardment could not reach. He ordered engineers to begin construction of an elaborate underground fortress system, utilizing the island's natural caves formed by ancient lava flows and volcanic rock that could be excavated with effort. 25% of the entire garrison was detailed to excavation work, a massive allocation of manpower that drew immediate criticism from subordinate officers who believed men should be training for combat rather than digging tunnels. According to his former chief of staff, the general often emphasized that America's productive powers were beyond Japanese imagination. Japan had started a war with a formidable enemy, and defenders must brace themselves accordingly by preparing positions that could withstand everything American industry could throw at them. The engineering project that unfolded over following months represented one of the most sophisticated defensive fortification efforts of the Pacific War. Mining engineers were dispatched from Japan to design the underground network properly, creating blueprints for tunnels at varying levels to ensure proper ventilation and minimize effects of explosions near entrances. By February 1945, Japanese engineers had excavated approximately 18 kilometers of tunnels connecting defensive positions across the entire island. This represented extraordinary effort given available tools, manpower, and geological challenges. Volcanic rock was hard, but could be worked with determination. Engineers identified natural cave systems formed by ancient lava tubes, then expanded these with hand tools and limited explosives, connecting separate cave complexes into integrated defensive networks. Soldiers assigned to tunnel duty worked in conditions that tested human endurance. Temperatures inside excavation sites ranged from 30 to 50 degrees Celsius as volcanic rock radiated intense heat that turned underground passages into suffocating ovens. Men collapsed regularly from heat exhaustion. Water was rationed strictly, forcing workers to labor in dehydrating heat with minimal hydration. Dust from pulverized volcanic rock filled lungs, causing respiratory problems. Lighting was minimal, forcing men to work in semi-darkness. Ventilation shafts had to be carefully positioned to provide air circulation without creating obvious surface features that aerial reconnaissance could detect. Despite these hardships, work continued 7 days per week. Kuribayashi pushed subordinates relentlessly, knowing American invasion could come at any time and that every additional day of preparation might save Japanese lives or cost American lives. The garrison defending Iwo Jima represented a cross-section of Japan's military at this late stage of the war. The core fighting force consisted of the 109th Division, approximately 13,000 army personnel organized into 2 independent mixed brigades. The 2nd Independent Mixed Brigade under Major General Kutao Osuga numbered approximately 5,000 men, while the 145th Infantry Regiment commanded by Colonel Masuo Ikeda contributed 2,700 soldiers. Naval forces totaled approximately 7,500 men from the 27th Air Flotilla under Rear Admiral Toshinosuke Ichimaru. This inter-service cooperation was unusual in Japanese military practice, where Army and Navy often operated with minimal coordination or even open hostility. Kuribayashi managed to forge these separate forces into something approaching unified command, though friction remained constant. Unlike veteran formations that had fought in China or during early Pacific campaigns, many defenders were recent conscripts with minimal training. Some were middle-aged reservists called up as Japan scraped the bottom of its manpower reserves. Men with families and civilian careers who found themselves suddenly thrust into military service. Others were support troops and administrative personnel pressed into combat roles as the empire's strategic situation deteriorated. Training standards had declined precipitously as Japan's training infrastructure collapsed under relentless Allied pressure. Experienced instructors were dead, wounded, or deployed to combat zones. Training time was compressed as manpower demands accelerated. Equipment was obsolete, ammunition for training was scarce. Many defenders arriving on Iwo Jima had fired their rifles only a handful of times. Among the most notable officers was Colonel Baron Takechi Nishi, commander of the 26th Tank Regiment. Born into nobility on July 12, 1902, Nishi had won a gold medal in show jumping at the 1932 Los Angeles Olympics, becoming a celebrity in Hollywood circles and befriending stars like Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and Mary Pickford. His Olympic victory had made him one of Japan's most famous athletes, celebrated in newspapers, feted at receptions, admired by a public eager for international recognition of Japanese achievement. Nishi had enjoyed his time in California, finding Americans friendly and welcoming. He spoke English fluently, understood American culture, and had maintained friendships with Americans even as tensions between nations escalated. His widow later recalled that Nishi had been despondent after Pearl Harbor, knowing that war with America was strategic madness, but feeling bound by duty. Like Kuribayashi, Nishi understood that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict against American industrial power. Unlike civilian politicians who might have resigned, or military officers who might have protested, Nishi accepted his duty with aristocratic sense of obligation. His emperor had called, his nation was at war, personal misgivings were irrelevant. On July 18, 1944, while sailing from Busan, Korea to Iwo Jima, the transport ship carrying Nishi's regiment was torpedoed by American submarine USS Cobia. All 28 of the regiment's tanks sank to the bottom of the Pacific, along with most of the regiment's equipment and supplies. Nishi returned to Tokyo to requisition replacements, managing to secure 22 tanks through personal connections and bureaucratic persistence. During this brief visit home, he made a final trip to visit his beloved horse Uranus, who had carried him to Olympic glory. The visit was deeply emotional, both man and animal seeming to understand they would never meet again. Nishi spent hours with Uranus, grooming him, feeding him treats, speaking softly in the stable, while grooms discreetly allowed privacy. When Nishi finally departed, witnesses reported tears in his eyes. It was the last time he would touch anything from his former life, the last connection to years when he was celebrated for athletic achievement rather than preparing to die in a hopeless battle. Through late 1944, defensive preparations intensified despite constant harassment from American aircraft and submarines. The defenders discovered that Iwo Jima's black volcanic ash, when mixed with cement in proper proportions, created superior concrete. Pillboxes were constructed with reinforced concrete walls 4 feet thick, capable of withstanding direct hits from naval shells up to 8 inches in diameter. Firing ports were designed to provide maximum field of fire while minimizing exposure to counterfire. Camouflage was extensive, with positions built to blend into rocky terrain so completely that American intelligence officers examining aerial photographs often could not distinguish fortifications from natural features. The Japanese installed approximately 300 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers, 33 naval guns ranging from 4.7 to 6 inches in bore diameter, 438 artillery pieces including mortars and field guns, 69 anti-tank guns specifically positioned to destroy American armor, and Nishi's 22 tanks. Rather than holding tanks in reserve for counterattacks as doctrine suggested, Kuribayashi ordered them dug into fixed positions and buried up to their turrets to serve as fortified artillery emplacements. This decision was controversial among tank officers who believed armor should remain mobile, but Kuribayashi understood that American air superiority made mobile operations suicidal. Tanks buried in prepared positions could survive bombardment and provide direct fire support until destroyed. Gasoline-powered generators allowed radios and lighting to operate underground. Communication wire was strung through tunnel systems, connecting defensive positions into integrated networks. Hundreds of hidden artillery and mortar positions were placed across the island with careful attention to fields of fire and mutual support. Every position could deliver fire to support adjacent positions. Every approach was covered by multiple weapons. The Japanese defensive preparations transformed every part of Iwo Jima into a potential killing zone, where attackers would face fire from multiple concealed positions simultaneously. Kuribayashi's defensive philosophy broke fundamentally with Japanese military tradition in ways that extended beyond tactical considerations. He explicitly forbade banzai charges, those mass frontal assaults that had characterized Japanese defensive tactics throughout the Pacific War. Such charges fulfilled cultural expectations of honorable death in combat, allowing soldiers to die facing enemies with weapons in hand, but accomplished nothing militarily. Kuribayashi argued that charging into American machine guns and artillery was suicide without purpose. Instead, every Japanese soldier on Iwo Jima received orders to kill at least 10 Americans before dying. The goal was not victory, which all understood was impossible, but attrition. If defenders could inflict casualties at a 10-to-1 ratio, if they could make Americans pay such a terrible price that invasion of Japan's home islands seemed unthinkable, then perhaps their deaths would serve some purpose beyond empty gestures. This order represented radical departure from cultural norms. Japanese military tradition emphasized death over capture, honorable death in combat over survival, aggressive action over passive defense. Kuribayashi was telling men to hide in tunnels, to shoot Americans from concealment, to survive as long as possible even if surrounded, to abandon traditional warrior values in favor of pragmatic tactics designed to kill efficiently. Some officers objected, arguing that such tactics dishonored Japanese martial traditions. Kuribayashi overruled objections with harsh reality. Traditional tactics had failed repeatedly across the Pacific, wasting Japanese lives without delaying American advances. Iwo Jima's defenders would fight intelligently or they would die pointlessly. Food supplies on the island were always inadequate. Japan's merchant marine had been devastated by American submarines, making resupply hazardous and irregular. Rice was supplemented with whatever could be grown locally, which was almost nothing given volcanic soil and water scarcity. Fish could be caught when time permitted, though American air attacks made ocean fishing extremely dangerous. Defenders subsisted on shrinking rations, knowing that starvation would eventually weaken garrison strength even without combat. Water was even more critical than food. The island had no natural fresh water sources beyond rainfall, which had to be collected and stored. Wells dug into volcanic rock yielded only small amounts of brackish water. Defenders were constantly thirsty, rationing water strictly while working in heat that caused profuse sweating. Medical facilities were established in cave systems, with limited supplies and minimal equipment. Doctors and medics understood they would eventually face mass casualties with inadequate means to treat them. Surgical supplies were stockpiled as much as possible, but everyone knew that once serious fighting began, wounded would overwhelm medical capacity quickly. Morphine and other pain medications were strictly rationed. Bandages, antiseptics, even basic medical instruments were in short supply. Japanese military medical care had never matched Western standards, and by late 1944, shortages affected every aspect of medical preparedness. As 1944 turned to 1945, Kuribayashi wrote letters to his family with increasing frequency, knowing each might be his last. These letters provide extraordinary insight into his state of mind as American invasion approached. He wrote to his wife Yoshi about practical matters, about their children's education, about family finances, about life after his death. To his children, he wrote with tenderness that contrasted sharply with his military reputation. He advised his son about becoming a man, about duty and honor, about caring for his mother and sisters. He wrote to his daughters about growing up in a world that would be very different from the one he had known, about maintaining family traditions, about perseverance through hard times. In one particularly poignant letter dated January 1945, Kuribayashi wrote words that captured his tragic acceptance. "We are still fighting. The strength under my command is now about 400. Our officers and men know about death very well. I am sorry to end my life here, fighting the United States of America, but I want to defend this island as long as possible and to delay the enemy air raids on Tokyo. Watch out for your health and live long. The future of our children will not be easy either. Please take care of them after my death." These words demonstrated that Kuribayashi harbored no illusions about his fate or the battle's outcome. He would die on Iwo Jima, his men would die with him, and their deaths might delay American bombers from reaching Tokyo for a few weeks or months at most. Beginning June 15, 1944, American B-24, Liberator and B-25 Mitchell bombers raided the island for 74 consecutive days, the longest pre-invasion bombardment of the Pacific War. Wave after wave of aircraft appeared overhead, dropping tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs on airfields, defensive positions, and any visible structure. These attacks cratered airfields repeatedly, though Japanese work crews repaired damage each night. Buildings were destroyed, supply dumps burned, anything above ground was systematically demolished. But attacks had limited effectiveness against underground fortifications. Bombs that landed directly above tunnel systems might collapse entrances or cause temporary cave-ins, but the defensive network remained largely intact. American intelligence assessments severely underestimated both defensive preparations and garrison strength. Reconnaissance photographs showed cratered airfields and destroyed buildings, leading planners to conclude that months of bombing had significantly degraded Japanese capabilities. Intelligence estimates suggested the garrison numbered perhaps 13,000 to 15,000 troops, well below actual strength of approximately 21,000. More critically, aerial photographs could not penetrate underground to reveal the extensive tunnel network. Photo interpreters studying images before invasion identified some defensive positions, but missed most of them. American planners expected resistance to collapse quickly once Marines landed, perhaps within 5 days. This catastrophic intelligence failure would cost American lives measured in thousands. February 16, 1945, marked the beginning of the final assault phase. The pre-invasion naval bombardment began with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashing devastating firepower from offshore. Battleship guns, ranging from 14 to 16 inches in bore diameter, fired shells weighing up to 2,700 pounds. Cruiser guns added 8-inch shells. Destroyers contributed 5-inch fire. The combined bombardment was supposed to pulverize Japanese defenses, making the landing relatively easy. Major General Harry Schmidt of the Marine Corps had requested 10 days of heavy bombardment, understanding that Iwo Jima's defenses required thorough preparation. He received only 3 days, impaired by weather conditions that limited visibility and accuracy. The Japanese defenders took shelter in their tunnels, waiting out the storm of steel raining down on positions above. Inside the underground complexes, men huddled in darkness, feeling the mountains shake with each impact. Dust and debris fell constantly from tunnel ceilings. The sound was indescribable, continuous rolling thunder that made conversation impossible and drove some men to the edge of sanity. Kuribayashi moved through tunnel systems during bombardment, maintaining command presence, ensuring officers stayed at posts, bolstering morale through personal example. He knew bombardment would end, Americans would land, and then the real battle would begin. On February 17th, 12 LCI gunboats moved close to shore to support underwater demolition teams tasked with clearing beach obstacles and identifying defensive positions. The Japanese emerged from tunnels and opened fire with everything available: artillery, mortars, machine guns, all concentrated on the vulnerable gunboats. The vessels were devastated, with LCY 449 sunk and several others severely damaged. Casualties totaled 170 killed and wounded. But the sacrifice revealed many hidden Japanese positions, allowing battleships Tennessee and Idaho to move within 2,500 yards of shore on February 18th to pulverize specific targets with devastating accuracy. For defenders whose positions were identified, the experience was nightmarish. 16-inch shells impacted with incredible force, obliterating anything above ground, collapsing some tunnel sections, killing men through sheer concussive effect, even when shells didn't penetrate their positions directly. Inside the tunnels, the experience of bombardment tested defenders' endurance and sanity in ways that went beyond physical danger. The psychological pressure of hours spent underground while tons of explosives detonated overhead was crushing. Men sat in darkness, unable to see, unable to do anything but wait and hope their position wouldn't take a direct hit. Some prayed, reciting Buddhist sutras or Shinto prayers. Others sat in silence, withdrawn into themselves. Some wrote final letters to families, though whether these letters would ever reach Japan was questionable. Officers moved among troops, offering encouragement, maintaining discipline, ensuring defensive positions remained manned despite overwhelming human impulse to flee or surrender. The Americans fired approximately 22,000 shells at Iwo Jima during the 3-day pre-invasion bombardment. Each shell represented a reminder of industrial might arrayed against defenders who understood intellectually, but perhaps couldn't fully comprehend emotionally the extent of American material superiority. Yet Kuribayashi's defensive strategy proved sound. Underground positions survived largely intact. When bombardment lifted on the morning of February 19th, defenders emerged from tunnels to man positions, prepared to execute the defensive plan that had consumed months of preparation and cost so much in hardship and labor. At 08:59 on February 19, 1945, the first wave of Marines from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches. Amphibious tractors seemed endless, wave after wave approaching shore in formations that stretched across the landing zone. Offshore, the support fleet extended to the horizon. Hundreds of ships representing an assembly of naval power beyond anything defenders had ever witnessed. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transports, supply vessels. The armada was staggering in scale. For defenders watching from concealed positions, the sight must have reinforced understanding that they faced an enemy whose resources were essentially unlimited. Landing craft struggled through heavy surf and steep beaches. The southeastern beaches where Marines landed featured unusual terrain, with volcanic sand rising sharply from water's edge to create terraces 15 feet high in some locations. Marines jumped from tractors and immediately sank ankle-deep into loose volcanic sand that offered no footing. Every step was an effort, like trying to run through loose gravel. Equipment was heavy, men were exhausted from the landing, and volcanic ash was soft and loose, causing vehicles to flounder as engines screamed and tracks spun uselessly, unable to gain traction. Some tractors became stuck immediately, blocking routes inland for following vehicles. Kuribayashi's orders were explicit. Let them land, let them pack the beaches, wait until maximum numbers were ashore and crowded together, then open fire with everything. For nearly 30 minutes, Marines advanced with surprisingly light resistance. Scattered rifle fire and occasional mortar rounds represented the only opposition. Marines pushed inland cautiously, expecting heavy resistance that didn't materialize. Officers urged men to move faster, take advantage of light opposition, seize objectives before Japanese defenders could react. Some units advanced hundreds of yards, reaching the western coast and cutting Mount Suribachi off from the island's main defenses. Marines began to think the bombardment had been more effective than anyone expected, that Japanese resistance might collapse quickly. Then Kuribayashi gave the order. Every artillery piece, every mortar, every machine gun position opened fire simultaneously in a carefully coordinated barrage. The beaches became a killing zone. Japanese artillery, pre-registered on every sector of the beach through months of careful preparation, fired with devastating accuracy. Mortar rounds fell like rain. Machine gun fire swept approaches to the terrace marking the edge of the beach, cutting down Marines attempting to advance. Men dove for cover that did not exist, pressing themselves flat against volcanic sand that offered no protection. Medical corpsmen rushed to treat wounded, only to become casualties themselves. The carefully orchestrated defensive fire plan was working exactly as designed. Marines responded with their own firepower, calling for naval gunfire support, for airstrikes, for tank support. Naval shells screamed overhead, impacting Japanese positions with thunderous explosions. Aircraft dove on suspected enemy locations, dropping bombs and napalm. Tanks that managed to get off the beach brought direct fire to bear on bunkers and pillboxes. But Japanese positions were well constructed and carefully camouflaged. Many survived initial counterfire, continuing to pour devastating fire into crowded landing zones. Kuribayashi had designed his defenses specifically to survive bombardment and inflict maximum casualties, and the system was functioning as intended. By day's end, approximately 30,000 Marines had landed, establishing a beachhead that stretched the width of the southern end of the island. They had cut Mount Suribachi off from the island's main defenses, a significant tactical achievement. But the cost had been tremendous. Over 500 Marines killed and more than 1,800 wounded on the first day alone. These casualty figures shocked commanders who had expected lighter opposition. The beach resembled a slaughterhouse, littered with destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and dead men. Medical personnel were overwhelmed, treating wounded as fast as possible while additional casualties continued arriving. Blood soaked into volcanic sand, turning it dark and muddy. That first night, Marines prepared for the massive banzai charges that had characterized previous Pacific battles. Defensive positions were strengthened, ammunition was distributed. Every Marine was alert for the screaming suicide charges that Japanese forces had launched on islands like Saipan and Tarawa. But Kuribayashi's orders forbade such attacks. The night passed with only minor probing attacks designed to gather intelligence on American positions rather than achieve any tactical objective. Marines remained on high alert, confused by the absence of expected banzai charges, but grateful for relatively quiet night that allowed them to consolidate positions, evacuate wounded, and prepare for continuing battle. The battle for Mount Suribachi began in earnest on February 20th. The 28th Marine Regiment started the slow, brutal process of reducing Japanese defenses on the 550-foot volcanic cone. Colonel Kanehiko Atsuchi commanded approximately 1,800 defenders in elaborately prepared positions throughout the mountain. Tunnels honeycomb Suribachi, connecting defensive positions at multiple levels. Artillery positions near the summit could deliver fire across the entire southern end of the island. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Marines advanced yard by yard, using flamethrowers to clear bunkers, explosives to collapse tunnel entrances, grenades to kill defenders in pillboxes. The fighting was intimate and horrifying. Men died at ranges measured in feet, sometimes grappling hand-to-hand when ammunition ran out or weapons jammed. The Japanese fought from prepared positions with fanatical determination, falling back through connecting tunnels when positions became untenable, then emerging to fight again from new angles. This defense in depth meant that positions which appeared cleared would suddenly come alive again as defenders used tunnel networks to reoccupy supposedly secured bunkers. Marines learned to thoroughly destroy every position, collapsing tunnels with explosives, sealing cave entrances with bulldozers, using flamethrowers to ensure no defenders remained alive to emerge later. The process was slow, dangerous, and exhausting. By February 23rd, after 4 days of continuous fighting that cost hundreds of American casualties, a Marine patrol reached Suribachi's summit. Sergeant Ernest Thomas, Platoon Sergeant Thomas, Corporal Charles Lindbergh, and Private First Class Louis Charlo climbed the cratered slopes to plant an American flag. They raised a small flag at 10:20 hours, triggering cheers from Marines across the beachhead who could see the stars and stripes flying from Suribachi's peak. Later that day, a second, larger flag was raised to replace the first. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured this second flag raising in what would become perhaps the most iconic image of World War II, reproduced on posters, stamps, memorials, seared into American cultural memory. But for Japanese defenders remaining in tunnels beneath the mountain, the flag meant battle would continue underground. Isolated groups of soldiers would continue fighting in the Suribachi tunnel complex for weeks after the mountain's surface had been declared secured. Small groups emerged at night to attack American positions, to scavenge for food and water, to die in brief firefights before melting back into tunnel systems. American forces systematically sealed cave entrances, pumped gasoline into tunnel systems and ignited it, used explosives to collapse sections, but defenders continued holding out in isolated pockets for extraordinary lengths of time. The main Japanese defensive positions lay in the northern part of the island, where Kuribayashi had concentrated his strength in terrain that favored defenders overwhelmingly. The northern highlands consisted of broken ground carved by ancient lava flows, deep ravines where vehicles couldn't operate, rocky ridges providing natural defensive positions, and countless caves that had been transformed through engineering into an integrated killing zone with mutually supporting defensive positions. Every advance into this area would be contested from multiple directions simultaneously. There were no flanks to turn, no weak points to exploit. American forces would have to reduce each position individually through direct assault. The Marines gave the northern strongpoints names that reflected the horror of fighting there. The Meat Grinder, Turkey Knob, Hill 382, the Amphitheatre, Bloody Gorge. Each represented a complex of fortified positions that had to be reduced through close combat under fire from positions that seemed to regenerate no matter how thoroughly they were attacked. The 3rd, 4th and 5th Marine Divisions attacked these positions simultaneously, advancing slowly against fanatical resistance that seemed to intensify rather than weaken as the battle progressed. The fighting in northern Iwo Jima introduced American forces to the full horror of Kuribayashi's defensive system. Positions that appeared destroyed after hours of bombardment and assault would come alive with renewed fire hours later as defenders emerged from connecting tunnels to reoccupy bunkers. A pillbox might be assaulted, cleared with flamethrowers and grenades, declared secured, only to open fire again that evening when fresh defenders used tunnels to reach the position. Marines developed specialized tactics for tunnel warfare, using teams of riflemen, demolitions experts, and flamethrower operators working in careful coordination. Flamethrower teams became essential for clearing connected chambers, though they suffered casualty rates approaching 92% as Japanese defenders recognized the threat and targeted flamethrower operators specifically. Marine tank battalions found their M4A3R3 flame tanks in constant demand for reducing fortifications. These specialized vehicles mounted flamethrowers with extended range, allowing them to project streams of burning napalm into cave entrances and bunkers from relatively safe distances. By battle's end, the 5th Marine Division's flame tanks were expending between 5,000 and 10,000 gallons of napalm daily, an extraordinary consumption rate that required constant resupply. The smell of burning napalm, burning equipment, and burning human flesh became pervasive across the battlefield, a stench that Marines would remember decades later with visceral revulsion. As February turned to March, the Japanese defensive position became increasingly desperate. Casualties mounted daily as American firepower slowly ground down the garrison. Food supplies dwindled to starvation rations, with defenders subsisting on handfuls of rice and whatever could be scavenged. Water became so scarce that men suffered from severe dehydration even while fighting, their bodies unable to sweat properly, their thinking becoming confused and irrational from fluid loss. Medical supplies ran out entirely, leaving wounded to suffer without even basic pain relief. Men with shattered limbs, with abdominal wounds, with burns covering their bodies, lay in darkness, enduring agony that no morphine could ease because no morphine remained. Ammunition stocks approached exhaustion for some calibers, forcing defenders to scavenge American weapons and ammunition from battlefield dead. Yet the defense continued with determination that astounded American forces. Japanese soldiers fought from positions until physically unable to continue, then committed suicide with grenades or pistols rather than surrender. Officers shot wounded who could not be evacuated, granting them warrior's death rather than allowing capture. The cultural prohibition against surrender remained overwhelmingly powerful despite hopeless circumstances. To be captured was to dishonor oneself, one's family, one's emperor. Death in combat, no matter how futile, was infinitely preferable to the shame of capture. Baron Nishi's tank regiment, with tanks destroyed or immobilized, fought as infantry from prepared positions in the Northern Highlands. American forces knew Nishi was on the island. Intelligence officers who knew his background attempted broadcasts in English and Japanese, appealing for him to surrender, pointing out that the world would regret losing such a celebrated figure, that his Olympic achievements had earned him international respect, that surrender would not dishonor him under these circumstances. Nishi never responded. He remained with his men, sharing their hardships, maintaining discipline and morale, even as the situation became utterly hopeless. On approximately March 22nd, Nishi was killed in action. The exact circumstances remain unknown, lost in the chaos of final battles in the Northern Highlands. His body was never identified among thousands of Japanese dead. Some accounts suggest he committed ritual suicide when his position was overrun. Others indicate he died leading his remaining troops in combat. Nishi was posthumously promoted to Major General and awarded the Order of the Rising Sun, 3rd class, gold rays with neck ribbon, honors that meant everything to his widow and children, but came too late for the man himself. By mid-March, American advances had compressed remaining Japanese forces into an area of less than 1 square mile in the northern tip of the island. Kuribayashi's command structure remained intact despite catastrophic losses, with communication lines still functioning through the tunnel network. On March 17th, the general sent his final message to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, words that captured both his tactical situation and his emotional state after 4 weeks of continuous battle. The battle is approaching its end. The strength under my command is now about 400. Tanks have invaded our last defense line at various sectors. They are now attacking our last stronghold. We continue to fight. His earlier message on March 16th had been even more poignant, revealing the thoughts of a commander watching his garrison die. I am very sorry, because I can imagine the scenes of disaster in our empire. However, I comfort myself a little, seeing my officers and men die without regret after struggling in this inch-by-inch battle against an overwhelming enemy with many tanks and being exposed to indescribable bombardments. The Americans declared Iwo Jima secured on March 26, 1945, exactly 36 days after the invasion began. But the declaration was premature. Fighting continued for weeks afterward as Japanese soldiers in sealed cave systems continued resisting, emerging at night to attack American positions, to scavenge for food and water, to die in brief firefights before disappearing back underground. American forces systematically sealed tunnel entrances with explosives and bulldozers, pumped seawater into cave systems to drown defenders, used grenades and flamethrowers to clear underground positions. The process was gruesome, methodical, and seemingly endless. Just when one section seemed cleared, defenders would appear elsewhere, having moved through connecting tunnels to continue fighting. The last organized resistance ended with Kuribayashi's death, believed to have occurred on March 26th, when he led approximately 300 remaining soldiers in a final attack against American positions near the northern coast. This attack violated every principle Kuribayashi had emphasized throughout the battle. No banzai charges, no wasteful frontal assaults, fight intelligently from prepared positions. But with organized defense no longer possible, with ammunition exhausted, With men dying from wounds and starvation, with no hope of relief or reinforcement, Kuribayashi apparently chose to end the battle on his own terms. He led from the front as tradition demanded, sword in hand, charging into American guns in a final gesture that acknowledged both defeat and defiance. Kuribayashi's body was never found or identified among the hundreds of Japanese dead recovered after this final attack. Rear Admiral Ichimaru also died during this final period, though circumstances of his death remain unclear. The two senior commanders thus died as they had lived, fighting to the end despite knowing their deaths would change nothing. Their bodies, like thousands of others, remain somewhere on Iwo Jima, buried in collapsed tunnels or lost in mass graves where American burial details interred Japanese dead without identification. The casualty figures shocked both nations when finally compiled. American forces suffered 26,038 total casualties, including approximately 6,821 deaths. Marine casualties totaled 5,931 killed in action, died of wounds, or missing in action and presumed dead. This represented more Marine deaths than in all of World War I, a staggering statistic that illustrated the battle's horrific intensity. An additional 209 deaths occurred among Navy corpsmen and surgeons assigned to Marine units. Approximately 19,217 Marines were wounded, many grievously, with amputations, severe burns, and traumatic injuries that would affect them for life. This represented the only major Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties numerically, though Japanese combat deaths were 3 times American deaths proportionally. For Japan, the cost was even more catastrophic. Of approximately 21,000 defenders, only 1,083 survived the battle. A mere 216 were captured during actual fighting, with the rest emerging from caves and tunnels in weeks and months afterward, so weakened by starvation and dehydration that they could no longer resist. 2 Japanese soldiers remained in hiding until January 6, 1949, nearly 4 years after the battle ended, finally surrendering after years of living in the tunnel system, surviving on scavenged supplies and rainwater, isolated from all human contact, unaware the war had ended nearly 4 years earlier. The strategic value of Iwo Jima justified the terrible cost in American strategic calculations, though this remained controversial among historians and veterans. By war's end, 2,251 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on the island, saving an estimated 24,761 airmen who would otherwise have ditched in the Pacific or crashed attempting to reach the Marianas with damaged aircraft. The first emergency landing occurred on March 4, 1945, while fighting still raged in the Northern Highlands, when the B-29, nicknamed Dynamite, touched down with battle damage and fuel exhaustion. P-51 Mustang fighters based on Iwo Jima began escorting bombing raids to Tokyo and other Japanese cities, dramatically reducing bomber losses. The island served as a base for air-sea rescue operations, allowing faster response to downed air crews. Yet the strategic calculus remained debatable. American bombing campaign was already devastating Japanese cities with or without Iwo Jima as a base. Whether 24,000 saved aircrew justified 6,800 Marine deaths depended on moral calculations that had no definitive answer. The Battle of Iwo Jima produced 27 Medals of Honor, more than any other single battle in Marine Corps history, with 13 awarded posthumously. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, commenting on the battle's ferocity and the courage displayed by both sides, offered words that became famous. Among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue. The battle demonstrated that Japanese forces could inflict terrible casualties, even when facing overwhelming American material superiority. Kuribayashi's tactics showed that determined defenders in prepared positions could extract a horrific price from attackers, regardless of firepower advantages. Military planners projecting future operations used Iwo Jima as a baseline for estimating casualties during proposed invasion of Japan's home islands. If an 8-square-mile volcanic rock cost nearly 7,000 American dead to capture, what would invasion of Kyushu and Honshu cost? Projections ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American casualties, with Japanese casualties expected to reach tens of millions, including civilian deaths. These projections contributed significantly to the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, rather than launch Operation Downfall, the planned invasion that would have dwarfed all previous amphibious operations. For Japanese families of men who died on Iwo Jima, the battle's aftermath brought only grief without closure. Most of the dead were never recovered or identified. Families received notification of death in battle, brief impersonal letters from military bureaucracy, but no bodies to bury, no graves to visit, no certainty about how their loved ones had died. This inability to properly honor the dead carried special significance in Japanese culture, where Buddhist tradition emphasized the importance of proper burial rites and maintenance of family graves. Sons and fathers and brothers had simply vanished into volcanic rock, their remains lost forever, their spirits unable to find rest according to traditional beliefs. Even decades after the war, Japanese search teams continued recovering remains from Iwo Jima's caves, a grim task that yielded fragmentary skeletal remains and occasional personal effects that might allow identification. The remains of more than 10,000 Japanese soldiers still rest under the island's volcanic soil, entombed in collapsed tunnels and sealed caves that will likely never be reopened. In the immediate post-war years, the Battle of Iwo Jima remained largely forgotten in Japan. The nation was consumed with rebuilding from total defeat, processing the horror of atomic bombing and firebombing that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The strategic bombing campaign had killed approximately 900,000 Japanese civilians. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed an estimated 200,000 people. In this context of unprecedented national catastrophe, Iwo Jima was simply one more disaster in a year filled with disasters. Decades later, historians and filmmakers began seriously examining the battle from the defenders' perspective. In 1970, Yoshi Kuribayashi represented Japanese families of war dead at a luncheon in Tokyo with American veterans visiting Japan. In a speech that moved attendees to tears, she thanked them for expressions of friendship and received a standing ovation from men who had fought against her husband. She later attended both the 1985 and 1995 reunions of honor hosted on the island itself. The 1985 reunion of honor brought together former enemies as old men, their wartime hatred mellowed by decades of peace and reflection. They walked battlefields together, visiting places where they had tried to kill each other 40 years earlier. Japanese veterans showed American Marines the tunnel systems they had defended, explaining defensive tactics and positions. American veterans explained their tactics for reducing these defenses, demonstrating flamethrower techniques and demolition procedures. The meetings were intensely emotional, marked by tears, embraces, and shared prayers for the dead on both sides. Veterans spoke of finding peace through reconciliation, of understanding that they had all been young men following orders, caught in circumstances beyond their control, doing their duty as they understood it. Similar reunions continued at 5-year intervals, building bridges between former enemies and demonstrating that even the most brutal conflicts could eventually give way to mutual respect and friendship. The physical island remains largely unchanged since 1945, preserved in its battle-scarred state as an unintentional memorial. Today it is officially known by its Japanese name, Iwo-to, reflecting post-war sovereignty. Civilian access is severely restricted, allowed only for memorial services attended by veterans and families of the fallen. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force operates a small naval air facility. The United States Navy occasionally uses the airfield for carrier landing practice under agreements with Japanese authorities. But mostly, Iwo Jima remains a memorial to the dead, where thousands of Japanese soldiers remain entombed in sealed caves, where American and Japanese monuments stand side by side, honoring courage and sacrifice. where volcanic sand still bears faint traces of fortifications that consumed so much labor and cost so many lives. Modern historians examining the battle with access to sources from both sides have reached generally consistent conclusions about its significance. Tactically, the battle demonstrated the effectiveness of defense in depth when properly implemented by competent commanders with adequate time to prepare. Kuribayashi's strategy inflicted maximum casualties and prolonged the battle far beyond American expectations, transforming what military planners expected to be a 5-day operation into a 36-day ordeal that approached the duration of much larger battles. Strategically, the island's value as an emergency landing field and fighter base justified its capture in American calculations, though debate continues whether the cost was proportionate to the benefit gained. The battle showcased American industrial might and logistical capability, the ability to project overwhelming force across thousands of miles of ocean and sustain combat operations indefinitely, while simultaneously demonstrating Japanese tactical skill, engineering prowess, and the extraordinary determination of defenders fighting from prepared positions with courage that commanded respect even from enemies. Cultural memory of Iwo Jima differs markedly between the United States and Japan, reflecting different national experiences of the war and its aftermath. In America, the battle holds iconic status in military history and national consciousness, exemplified by Rosenthal's photograph and the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, which recreates the flag raising in bronze. Every Marine learns about Iwo Jima during training, studies the battle's tactical lessons, understands its place in Corps history. The battle represents both the horror of combat and the courage of individuals facing that horror. In Japan, awareness remained limited for decades after the war. The battle was simply one more defeat in a year of defeats, overshadowed by strategic bombing, atomic weapons, and unconditional surrender. Public consciousness focused on victimization through bombing rather than examining military operations. This began changing in 2006 when Clint Eastwood's film Letters from Iwo Jima brought renewed attention to the defenders' perspective. The film, shot in Japanese with Japanese actors portraying historical figures, attempted to present the battle through Japanese eyes, honestly and respectfully. It was based on General Kuribayashi's published letters and the book So Sad to Fall in Battle by journalist Kumiko Kakehashi, which examined the general's life and the battle's impact on Japanese consciousness. Tactical innovations developed during the Battle of Iwo Jima influenced military doctrine for decades afterward. Combined arms tactics integrating infantry, armor, artillery, air support, and naval gunfire became standard practice in amphibious operations. The importance of specialized weapons for reducing fortifications was recognized, leading to development of improved flamethrowers, demolition charges, and bunker-busting munitions. Tunnel warfare techniques developed on Iwo Jima would be employed in later conflicts, particularly in Vietnam, where the Viet Cong employed similar underground defensive systems, requiring similar tactics to defeat. The battle demonstrated conclusively that even overwhelming firepower and numerical superiority could not eliminate the need for infantry to close with and destroy the enemy in fortified positions. This lesson, learned at terrible cost, influenced military planning and training for generations. General Kuribayashi's letters from Iwo Jima provide unique insight into his state of mind as American invasion approached and during the battle itself. His correspondence with his wife Yoshi and children revealed a man who loved his family deeply, accepted his own death as inevitable, performed his duty without illusions, and hoped desperately that his sacrifice would protect those he loved. In one letter, he expressed the philosophy that sustained him through months of preparation and weeks of battle. If our children can live safely for one more day, it would be worth the one more day that we defend this island. This belief sustained Japanese defenders through the hell of continuous combat, motivated them to endure conditions that tested human endurance limits, and gave meaning to deaths that might otherwise have seemed pointless. Whether the battle truly protected the homeland for any meaningful length of time remains debatable among historians. What cannot be debated is the sincerity of the belief and the extraordinary determination it produced. The Battle of Iwo Jima stands as one of history's most brutal confrontations. A 36-day struggle where approximately 27,000 men died or were grievously wounded on an 8-square-mile island that had no intrinsic value beyond its strategic location. It demonstrated the terrible price of war, the courage of individuals caught in circumstances beyond their control, and the possibility of reconciliation even after the most brutal conflicts. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, Baron Takechi Nishi, Rear Admiral Toshinosuke Ichimaru, and thousands of Japanese soldiers whose names history never recorded, fought with extraordinary courage for a cause already lost, following orders they could not refuse, dying for a homeland that would ultimately be saved not by their sacrifice, but by unconditional surrender.